This is an RNZ podcast.
This is Mediawatch. I'm Colin Peacock. Well, it's not often that the news media end up in court for defamation, but when they do, the rest of the media take note. And that's because the stakes are high in terms of reputation and in terms of the big bills that one side could end up paying, or both, depending on how it plays out. The biggest such case for years has just wound up, and this case was unusual in that it wasn't a person who was suing to restore their reputation, it was a company.
One News can pull back the curtain. These leaked photos taken by an anonymous whistleblower show a different side to the Ashburton factory.
So what was revealed when Talleys took on TVNZ and investigative journalism was investigated in court in detail.
The level of scrutiny, word by word, phrase by phrase, of any part of any story, so the caption, the summary, the pull quotes, the scripts and the promos of stories are subject to this sort of scrutiny.
What impact could this have on the way that investigative reporting is done and how it gets challenged? But before that, one of the big stories of this past week was Thursday's so-called mega strike of public sector workers. The biggest industrial action for years was a story in itself, but so was the government's staunch reaction and what the media made of it.
The government's argument, of course, is there is no money. The union's argument is that this is a question of choices. The government has made the wrong choices. So the question will be, which one of those arguments wins out in the mind of the public? And that right now is not clear. It could shift very quickly. It could shift like the wind.
That was RNZ's acting political editor Craig McCulloch on Morning Report last Thursday, the day of the so-called mega strike, and also enough wind to create red warnings, power cuts and states of emergency in many places. Even the Morning Report bird at the top of the hour sounded a bit like roofing iron being ripped off. But while the wind was really blowing in one direction on Thursday, fiercely, Craig McCulloch said it wasn't clear which way the public was leaning.
What is curious is that both sides seem to think that they have the public on their side, or at least that they can win the public to their side. I have to say, as an outside observer, it's not obvious who the public is backing here or who the public blames. There are arguments either way.
He went on to say that the government had been working extra hard to sway the public to their side via the media and online.
I mean, if you think about the open letter, the Facebook ads, the veiled threats, they've really made a calculation here to go fully on the attack, to paint the unions as being unreasonable, to hope that the frustrated public sides with them. When you wrap it all together, it's clear that this was a full-on offensive from the government. It has not helped to resolve the situation.
But this was, of course, a both-ways battle played out in the media for hearts and minds long before the day of the actual strike. In fact, it ramped up fully 7 days ago.
As we go to air this morning, Public Service Minister Judith Collins has accused union organisers of organising this week's huge planned strike for political reasons. It comes as the Council of Trade Unions welcomes a new president.
TVNZ's Jack Tame on the Q&A show last Sunday introducing Sandra Gray. And the second question for the new CTU president, as the mega strike loomed, was that open letter from the Public Services Minister, which had appeared on the Beehive's website and in the papers that day. In the Sunday Star Times, it shared a full page with a piece by the CTU's Richard Wagstaff, telling readers why the biggest public sector strikes in decades would be happening last Thursday. And in the Herald on Sunday, Judith Collins' piece was boxed off on a double page with an explainer about the upcoming strikes and the workers involved. And if you saw it online, Judith Collins' statement was addressed directly to the patients, students and families that would be affected by the strikes, to tell them that she reckoned it was really political. Now, the statement was, of course, also released to the media in the usual ways as well. And on 9 to noon, Andrew Curtin, former Chief of Staff for Chris Hipkins when he was Prime Minister, said that he couldn't recall a communication strategy quite so aggressive.
I don't think I've ever seen anything in my memory of that is this aggressive, coming out with an opinion piece that really sort of starts to stretch things a little bit. And the press release, what people didn't see in the papers with that op-ed was it was actually a press release from the minister that detailed a lot of facts underneath as well. So they're really laying it out.
And his fellow pundit on 9 to noon that day, Ben Thomas, formerly a press secretary to national government ministers, also reckoned it was a pretty staunch move.
This is a much more confrontational stance than I can remember, any government this century taking towards union action, I think. Look, to say it's political, that the strikes are on the same day, well, of course it's political and it's strategic.
Though Ben Thomas also pointed out the teachers have their own direct channel to parents as well.
And look, it's very hard to beat the teachers' unions. I was talking to somebody over the weekend who was telling me about, a slip of paper that went into his child's backpack, explaining early childhood reforms, and he said he showed it to his neighbour. It's it's pretty hard to replicate that with an open letter.
Remember.
Ben Thomas went on to say the rule of thumb was that the longer public sector strife goes on, the more the public blame the government for it. And on Wednesday, the Post reported this.
A majority of the public are in support of teachers, nurses and health workers walking off the job as politicians bicker over who is at fault and the politicisation of the industrial movement.
But who was in support? Well, 65% of 464 people polled by the pollster that does the Labour Party's polling. And Talbot Mills research also found that the strike supporters were also more likely to be opposition party supporters. But 7 days ago, it was Judith Collins' open letter that really grabbed the narrative in the media, and one particular claim.
So she said in her statement this morning that in recent negotiations with the Secondary Education Union, the top item on the union's agenda was Palestine. Not pay, not conditions, it was Palestine.
Jack Tame again on Q&A, and Judith Collins' claim that teachers' unions had that at the top of their agenda set the news agenda. 24 hours later, this was at the top of News Talk ZB's news.
The Prime Minister says there's no justification for the PPTA putting Gaza at the top of a strike meeting agenda. The Public Services Minister is accusing the PPTA of not prioritising members.
The Prime Minister did indeed give that Palestine angle legs on News Talk ZB earlier that morning, but the host of the Mike Hosking breakfast had already done that.
Very good letter from Judith Collins. I don't know that the media are going to run the whole thing. They should. You should all get a copy. Everyone should get one in the letterbox and you can read it. So first point, we regret even more, she says, in general regrets, that the strike appears to be politically motivated by the unions. What else could possibly explain? This was the showstopper for me, and it was the start of the letter.
So in fact, it was more of a show starter, as Judith Collins had intended, rather than a showstopper.
Not terms and conditions, not student achievement, not the new curriculum, Palestine. That's not what students or parents should expect, is it? I mean, does that come as a revelation to you?
Well, no, because it had been canvassed for over 24 hours by that point from many others in the media who also took the bait from the minister's open letter. But what were those details from Judith Collins that Mike Hosking reckoned should have been delivered to all our doors because the media might have ignored them? Well, they were actually pretty well canvassed by the media too. They included base salary offers of over $100,000 to the majority of experienced teachers, 5% pay increase for senior doctors over 2 years, and $8,000 more in pay for graduate nurses by the middle of next year. And the final fun fact from Judith Collins: public sector wages grew 2.8% in the year to June, she said, whereas the private sector only grew by 2.3%. Though that proved a bit inconvenient for Minister Chris Bishop on RNZ's Morning Report on Tuesday.
Well, actually, wages are on average rising faster than inflation.
Well, that's not what she said in her letter.
Well, no. Well, if you look at the measure of quarterly hourly earnings and the data that comes out that's released, wages are on average rising faster than inflation.
So hang on a second, why did she put that in her letter? She put in that letter, an open letter to New Zealanders about public and private sector wages, and I'm looking at it right now, and she's talking about public sector wage growth 2.8% the year to June, private sector wage growth was 2.3%. So which is it?
That'll be in the context of quite big pay increases for some of those groups that we're talking about in relation to strikes.
But the main point of all that was in the middle of Judith Collins' open letter, read aloud by News Talk ZB's Mike Hosking on Monday, like this.
In the financial year ending June 25, New Zealand spent $8.9 billion just servicing debt. This was more than the government spent on police, corrections, the Ministry of Justice, Customs and Defence combined.
But he did also point out that in this economy, public sector workers would be going backwards on the settlements offered when he asked the Prime Minister this.
What they're arguing over is 1%, 2%, and they're going, well, inflation's 2.7, we're actually going backwards, which is a mathematical fact. Would you pay them more if you had the money?
Yeah, we would, if we were a wealthier economy, like we see in other countries.
And the Prime Minister had one particular country in mind.
Think about Ireland, twice as wealthy per person as New Zealand, got twice as many teachers. They can pay their people more.
Ireland's GDP per head is higher than almost every European nation too, because it's heavily inflated by the income of multinational tech and pharmaceutical companies, which have been attracted by the Irish corporate tax regime. In fact, so much so that it warps the average across the entire Eurozone, according to The Economist magazine. And most of the income is funnelled abroad and not into Ireland's economy, The Economist said. Do they really have twice as many teachers as the Prime Minister said? Well, back in April, the Irish Education Minister was on their version of Morning Report, answering questions about teacher shortages there.
They have a significant number of unfilled teacher posts, 9,000 plus. What are you going to do about it?
Well, look, firstly, it's important to say that we have more teachers than ever before. There's about 20% more people have registered with the Teaching Council in recent years.
Well, a fact check of that claim by the Journal in Ireland found that, indeed, there is a record number of employed teachers there this year, 79,300, and there were also 127,000 individual registered teachers. But when the government here celebrated a new record number of teachers as well, just 2 months later in June, well, the number here was 74,104 in total and 150,000 registered according to our Teaching Council, so pretty close numbers to Ireland. One consolation then for those suffering from the effects of the strikes was we don't really have half the wealth or half the teachers they have in Ireland, where they do have also a similar shortage of teachers. But when the mega strike was all over, on Friday, it was the shortage of money to pay more to public service workers that the government was still highlighting. It doesn't grow on trees, Energy Minister Simon Watt said on Friday's Herald Now show.
Is the government saying no more money here? Like whatever the Public Service Commission's got to play with, that's it?
Well, look, there's no magic money tree. There's no, we've been really clear. We're going to give you and look to do a fair offer with the money that we have. We are under significant constraint.
And after that, his counterpart on Herald Now, Labour's Ginny Anderson, struggled to say where $200 million would come from for Labour's just-announced Future Fund.
Ginny, I've heard you say this before. So you're saying you will, if elected to government, reverse the changes for landlords?
No, I'm not saying that because I'm not our finance guy.
This is the problem.
We'll have a comprehensive package.
And after that, Simon Watt said the economy would change soon, just like the weather.
But the fundamentals of the actions we've taken mean that the economy is well placed for when the winds change on the economic front, and they will change.
But bearing in mind what the weather had just done in many parts of the country, pinning our economic hopes on the changing wind might not be as reassuring as he meant it to be. Last week here on Mediawatch, we talked to the Minister of Broadcasting about, among other things, the spotlight falling suddenly on the reach of the Broadcasting Standards Authority. And that was prompted by the broadcasting watchdog telling Sean Plunkett that it reckons his alternative streaming service, The Platform, is really a broadcaster under the law and that it can now consider complaints about what's said on the platform as if it was on TV or radio. And the Minister told us this was not the end of free speech or democracy in New Zealand.
A lot has been said. I don't think, our democracy is under threat.
But clearly it was a big deal for the platform's Sean Plunkett.
This is the bureaucrats, the Orwellian bureaucrats coming for us.
And last Monday, Sean Plunkett turned up at the Prime Minister's post-cabinet media conference and asked Christopher Luxon, what is a broadcaster?
Yeah, the issue is I think the situation raises some pretty good questions, and I've got a lot of sympathy about it being overreach and an impingement on free speech.
Well, that's a bit of a different response to the one the Media Minister gave on Mediawatch last weekend. Now, other pundits and politicians this past week have also loudly questioned the future of the Broadcasting Standards Authority as a result of this row, though reform of media regulation was in fact already under review, but fully under the radar. I looked at that in this week's Midweek Mediawatch last Wednesday on Nights with Emile Donovan. If you missed it, it's available for free in our podcast feed. Now, some of those who say we don't need an official broadcasting watchdog anymore point out that you can go to court if you feel you've really been wronged by the media, because we already have laws that protect privacy and copyright and other things, and also punish things like harassment, online bullying and more. And if someone, on air or online, lowers your reputation in the minds of right-thinking New Zealanders without good reason, well then you can sue them for defamation. News organisations don't often end up in court for that, but when they do, it's usually big news, and the stakes can be pretty high in terms of both reputation and money, because the courts can award significant sums in damages. The largest defamation payment award in New Zealand was back in 1994 to journalist Tony McRae after pretty scurrilous claims about her appeared in print in Metro magazine's notorious gossip column Felicity Ferret. And by its very nature, publishing gossip runs a big risk of defamation. But 10 years ago, Foreign Affairs reporter John Stevenson turned the tables by suing the chief of the New Zealand Defence Force for statements that wrongly cast doubt on his reporting about New Zealand's forces in Afghanistan. After a full jury trial for defamation, a second was about to begin when the New Zealand Defence Force, having already spent big sums on lawyers, settled for an undisclosed sum and a statement expressing regret. Now, last week, another media defamation case concluded, this decade's most notable one so far, according to the newsroom co-editor Tim Murphy, who we'll hear from in a minute. Over 5 weeks in court, lawyers for food processing giant Talley's went toe-to-toe with TVNZ's team and its lead lawyer, Davey Salmon KC, who also acted for John Stevenson 10 years ago. Now, Talley's were taking action over a series of reports by TVNZ's Christchurch-based reporter Thomas Mead that aired on One News in 2021 and 2022.
Tonight, One News can pull back the curtain. These leaked photos taken by an anonymous whistleblower show a different side to the Ashburton factory.
The series alleged suboptimal and sometimes dangerous work and hygiene practices at Talley's plants, as well as Talley's workers who said they were injured on the job and claimed they weren't fairly treated. And in court, Thomas Mead had to tell his role in the whole story from the start.
On 13 May 2021, I received an email from One News South Island managing editor Blair Norton asking if I could look into a tip sent in by a journalism student who has been mentored by a producer working on TVNZ's Sunday programme called Georgina Hannafin. Ms Hannafin had approached her mentor, saying she had been in contact with a contractor who repaired machines at the Ashburton factory and had concerns about the health and safety standards there. It was my understanding at the time.
Talley's even tried to force TVNZ to reveal the identity of some of their sources and the details of their allegations. But I made them a promise and I have kept it, TVNZ's Thomas Mead told the court, stating that some of those sources feared retaliation from Talley's. Now, for its part, Talley's told the court it didn't actually want damages from TVNZ, just an acknowledgement that it had suffered financial losses because of the reporting. But TVNZ countered that its reports were accurate, verified and, crucially, in the public interest, and that losing the case would also set a dangerous precedent for journalism. Now, in this case, there is no jury, just one judge who says his decision won't come out before the end of the year and maybe not until about Easter next year. But in the meantime, what can editors and reporters learn from what newsroom co-editor Tim Murphy described as a legal investigation of a news investigation? And what difference did it make that this was a company and not a person who claimed they'd been defamed?
This adds a level because companies cannot sue in their own right without being able to show that they have suffered pecuniary loss. Basically, it's cost them money. And if they can't prove that it's caused the loss, our Defamation Act expressly says then your case will fail.
Well, how did they go about showing that it's directly attributable to what was aired by TVNZ's One News?
They need to show that not only has there been loss immediately after or in the time frame of these pieces, which were in 2021, 2022, but also that the particular statements that they're suing on, so not even just the particular story, but the particular lines or statements they call imputations in defamation law in each story, then led to loss. What Talley's did was to say, we had contracts that were delayed with, for example, Countdown. We had an exclusivity arrangement with HelloFresh for meat products for dinners that would go out that way. Opprobrium for their staff and people in the community, they say, that they say is a cost because it can affect morale and productivity. They had the cost of an independent inquiry through Mike Bush, the former police commissioner. They had the cost of a PR firm, they said, to handle all of this inquiry And then they had costs of their management time, which were diverted from the normal process of productivity in their factories and so on. They said it couldn't always be absolutely specified to a dollar figure, but their view was, in total, it was obvious and inarguable that the TVNZ coverage had cost them financially.
And is it because of these complexities that it was a judge-only trial? They weren't trying to win hearts and minds of a jury?
Probably best that it was just a judge alone, because, it's mind-numbingly complex when you get into the detail of these things. Defamation cases do have and have had juries.
10 years ago when it was journalist John Stevenson suing the Chief of Defence for defamation, that was in front of a jury and the jury couldn't agree. They couldn't get to 10 out of 12. That case found it. I remember the foreman saying, "Sorry, Judge, we cannot reach agreement. There are some strong women on this jury," and all of the courtroom went stared and then trying to work out which ones and which way. And that was heading for a second jury trial, and then they settled. But in terms of if Tallies are saying, we want an acknowledgement that we suffered loss, we're not after any punitive damages, what are the actual stakes for both sides?
From past experience of complex defamation cases that went a long way, even if they didn't get to trial, both parties, TVNZ and Tallies, will have spent millions in legal costs to this point. The 5 weeks alone of the trial, with teams of lawyers, including King's Counsel each side, will have cost a fortune. But before that, it had gone to the High Court repeatedly for different interlocutory matters to be sorted. It went to the Court of Appeal and back on the issue of sources and whether they could be kept anonymous.
When the case began, Chief Executive at TVNZ, Jodie O'Donnell, was there accompanying Thomas Mead into court. Some people said, well, that's good, that shows solidarity at the top level. They're taking this very seriously. And did you see it that way, or did you see it possibly as a sign that is how big the stakes were, that this, because there's so much money involved, this is actually a matter for the person at the top to be right there on the ground when it was taking place?
It's certainly a big enough issue for the chief executive of an organisation like this to be across it and to be satisfied that TVNZ's doing the right thing in defending it to this point. But I think it was a matter of showing sort of pastoral care and boosting morale for not only Thomas Mead, the reporter, but also the general TVNZ newsroom. Quite a few of its number were under examination through this case. So there was a lot of personal support for the professional kind of dilemma. And I think that it was part of probably what the CEO was trying to do as well, to signal that we've gone this far backing you and this case and these stories, and we're going to continue to do so.
Well, you called it in one of your earlier pieces an investigation investigated, and I guess this scrutiny in court really does open up journalism to a level of exposure that we just don't often see. So there have been quite a few questions from Talley's lawyers about TVNZ's handling of anonymous sources and Thomas Mead's stories. Do you think TVNZ and Thomas Mead acted properly in using anonymous sources?
On anonymous sources, I think so. They cross-referenced, it seems, the main source for the first stories about machines being unguarded and photographs showing evidence of safety issues. That person's evidence was tested with another, as it turned out at the time, anonymous source. They seemed to actually go to good levels of requiring information that would validate those people's level of knowledge. For example, saying we need to see a payslip or a employment letter showing that you did in fact work there. I think there are other aspects of the case that there were vulnerabilities, and some of those were from perhaps some of the statements that those, or at least one of the anonymous sources made.
For example, TVNZ's viewers were told there was an accident waiting to happen in the introduction, and the lawyers were saying, well, actually, you can't point to anyone having actually uttered those words or have a record of it other than the reporter himself when he was voicing those words in his report. Is that a problem for them?
On the face of it, it might not be, but in this instance, and this is part of one of the vulnerabilities for TVNZ, I think, on the whole thing, is that the presentation by the news program and the newsreader, in this case Simon Dello, the material that was provided for him to intro the main story with and so on, they actually made claims that when they were examined in microscopic detail didn't match what the story itself said. The first story said that a whistleblower tells TVNZ it's an accident waiting to happen. And so the lawyers, and this is what lawyers do if they get this chance, they examine that to every sort of level and nuance to show that, in fact, from a transcript of the interview with that source and Thomas Mead, it was the reporter saying, so is this an accident waiting to happen? If you get a clear affirmative, then it's fair to paraphrase it and say the person agreed this is an accident waiting to happen, or the person said this was an accident waiting to happen. But in this case, the answer wasn't a firm affirmative, yes, it's an accident waiting to happen. It was a very discursive, almost abstract view on immigrant workers and them not being aware of exactly what it was they ought to have known and so on. So I think that was one of the aspects, that quote. But there were other elements where an anonymous source who later was named in court at their own instigation or clearance, that person was shown not to have been aware of a lot of Talley's safety audits and checks and inspections and changes and some improvements in the factory when, in the period that they were telling TVNZ and Thomas Mead that many things were wrong. And so when it was sort of looked at in detail, they were perhaps found not to have been as aware of the broader situation as they were claiming.
The need to summarise things and make them easily understood within a 3-minute or even shorter sometimes news bulletin item is a problem for particularly television broadcasters. But also they went further, didn't they, in alleging that TVNZ had actual animus, had kind of taken against Talley's and even cited, the certain use of words.
First, they said that they were very serious, the most serious kind of allegations that could be made against a particular food firm. And they said that, those were not tested properly and weren't from sources who had the full picture, but they also overlaid that with, particularly personally actually, against Thomas Mead himself, that there was a bias, a political view against Talley's, that from TVNZ there was almost a kind of an envy of the Talley's families, cars and houses and wealth and position and power. There was a sort of a default along the way to believe a whistleblower, an anonymous source, a critic, against whatever the prevailing view was from Talley's organisationally. Each time, they said, the reports would say, critic A says X, Talley's say Y, but you'd have to say that there's some real indications that X might be right. They kept arguing there was a default overweighting towards the critical view of them.
And Talley's also wanted more of this sort of information, didn't they? They wanted the names of sources, they wanted transcripts of interviews and their interactions with TVNZ. I think the justification they used was that would allow us to judge how well TVNZ had tested these sources' motivation, reliability and allegations. They didn't get all of that material that they wanted. Is it good that that was resisted in your mind?
It is. These things are vital for journalism and for, disclosure to the public of matters that might be of concern from powerful entities, setting aside Talley's for the moment. And TVNZ argued that too, right to the Court of Appeal, and won the right to continue with that protection of those sources, the ones that didn't in the end want to out themselves, if you like. The two sources whose names did get outed by themselves as sources, there were flaws found in what had gone on in the interview process and the research and reporting of what they said. So Talley said, well, if the two we know of we've found these issues, then what are we to make of what we don't know of from the other anonymous sources? And they were very quizzical about the fact that TVNZ wouldn't even present to the court a heavily redacted, they said, almost offering that almost everything could be redacted and blacked out transcript of these interviews so they could see that A, an interview ever happened, B, how long it was and how much was discussed.
And as an editor and formerly a reporter too, did you cringe a little bit when, messages between TVNZ parties and Thomas Mead and others were read out, personal messages that were, no reporter, no journalist would really want their personal messages aired in a courtroom like that, would they?
Well, yeah. In fact, the TVNZ lawyer Davy Salmon, but he said they were mild in context of workplaces and that everybody in that courtroom, other than the person sitting at the northeast end of the room, which was the judge, would have sent text messages more inappropriate than these.
The judge will take some time, I guess, to release a decision, may even be next year before we know the outcome. But in the meantime, do you think this will have an impact? Does it mean perhaps journalists and editors looking at this will think, actually, when we're dealing with a really complex and sensitive investigative story, we have to adopt quite a dry style, particularly if it's for television, rather than trying to paraphrase and make it more engaging and comprehensible, that actually things might need to be a little longer, a little less simplified if we're going to avoid the same sort of legal pushback from particularly a big company like Talley's in future stories that might be similar?
Almost certainly, Colin. The TVNZ newsroom and others will now see that the level of scrutiny, word by word, phrase by phrase, of any part of any story, so the caption, the summary, the pull quotes, the scripts and the promos of stories are subject to this sort of scrutiny. It's no bad thing, perhaps, in a way, for all of the media to be given a pretty sharp reminder that precision extends to every element of it. TVNZ's view was that if Talley's, with what they say is a sort of a nebulous claim to having suffered loss as a company and therefore having the right to sue on defamation, they say that if a company can succeed in a case like this, then it will open it up to all sorts of companies. I think Davy Salmon, the KC, said that it would be the Defamation Act inviting cases from basically people who have suffered no loss. On the other side, Talley's were of the view that if TVNZ won this, then it was open season in their view on companies and corporations. You know, this is the single worst kind of allegations you can make about a company, particularly a food company. They're saying that, you know, no company would be able to withstand reporting that they say would be an error or biased or, you know, whatever. So there were two big plays, and perhaps there really are big implications whichever way this goes.
We spoke about the anonymous sources, and your predecessor at the New Zealand Herald, Gavin Ellis, was there as an expert witness, and he pretty much gave a green light to the way they handled that issue. But just recently we had TVNZ changing its policy on that for television on concealing identities after John Campbell's, under his command, investigation about Destiny Church revealed too much of one individual. Is that a sign that maybe they do need to tighten up, that there may be laxities in the system that in this case could have exposed them to a greater legal jeopardy?
I think so. And, you know, the quiet moments, all of those involved at TVNZ then and now will see that there needed to be a tighter, clearer, more precise and weighted use of language and words, images as well as words, basically just to be more on edge at every point in the bringing together and presentation of these kinds of stories. So I think there will be change. It may well be for the better, even should Talley's, you know, be seen not to have suffered loss and not to have been defamed.
Those might be issues of kind of editorial oversight, you know, from the top down. But in terms of reporters and editors putting out individual stories and individual bulletins, is there a kind of more immediate thing of never air a quote or say it as reported speech if you really don't have a solid record of it?
If it's not overly contentious, if it's not in dispute, if it's not, you know, condemning of an individual or a company or an organisation, such quotes, paraphrases might be justified. But look, the argument for precision has never been made as strongly as the past 5 weeks. And I think, you know, the age-old thing that the media's sort of been accused of, but also talked about itself over time of, you know, this issue of sort of beating up appeal and the hooks of stories to get the absolute maximum out of them for what used to be sort of viewer or reader eyeballs and now clickbait, you know. That is something that this case has thrown light on as well. That's the kind of tone that's created that probably gave air to Talley's in deciding that they had a chance at a case here.
And, I mean, defamation cases aren't that common, but is it also true, Tim, that we don't hear about where reporting might be chilled because of the threat of it, or where a lawyer's letter has gone out and people have pulled back rather than, have to go through this sort of process that TVNZ has had to go through over the past 5 weeks?
Yeah, and while there are many times where lawyers' letters or even perhaps injunctions to delay material being aired or published occur, there are also many times where media companies facing such pushback or threats have ploughed on and do plough on. So I don't think the balance in the defamation setup that we have is as yet favouring organisations or the powerful or companies or the wealthy, if you like. The balance, I think, it was quite clear, I think, through the whole case that there was sort of a power play. It was a big corporation with, rich Lister family backers drawing a line in the sand in their view and saying, we've had power of the media thrown at us unfairly, so we're going to exert some power back the other way. And in fact, they made that point, Talley's directly, saying, there aren't many organisations or companies that would have the resources to be able to push back on our TVNZ, but we have, and that's fortunate that we have. So I think they did see, in a way, themselves as making a stand for organisations, companies that might be subject to intense media scrutiny from big audience, well-resourced organisations.
That was Tim Murphy, the co-editor of Newsroom and formerly a long-serving editor of the New Zealand Herald. And as you heard there, he covered the Talleys versus TVNZ defamation trial, which played out in court recently over 5 weeks. And his wrap-up of the whole thing is on the newsroom.co.nz site under the headline Truth, Justice and the TVNZ Way. Now, as we also mentioned there, the sole judge in this case said that while he hoped to deliver a ruling before the end of the year, the extension of the trial into a 5th week might mean the outcome isn't known until after Easter 2026. And finally, this weekend on Mediawatch, as we heard earlier, the headline-hogging news stories last Thursday were the so-called mega strike and the mega strong winds that caused havoc around the country. So maybe not surprising that it went a little under the radar that radio company Mediaworks announced a change that same day. The music station Magic will be replaced on FM next month by a new station on which Queen, Fleetwood Mac, ABBA and Elton John will, they say, take listeners back to moments when music meant everything. It's called Breeze Classic and it complements the existing station The Breeze, playing hits from the 80s, 90s and the 2000s. But on a day of gales tearing into large parts of the country, perhaps billing this as an extension of The Breeze was not the sort of thing the media wanted to be telling their audience. Magic, by the way, is the remnant of the brand that was Mediaworks' doomed vehicle for talk radio, Magic Talk, famously pulled off the air with immediate effect with the hosts not going quietly back in 2023. Magic now plays hits from the 1950s and 60s, but from next month it will exist only on the Mediaworks streaming app Rover. Well, that's all for this weekend. Thanks so much for listening. If you have any thoughts for us or ideas for us to follow up, do get in touch. Email us, mediawatch@rnz.co.nz, or you'll also find us at MediawatchNZ on X, or you can write us an old-fashioned letter and send it to Mediawatch, PO Box 123, Wellington. I'll be back next Wednesday with Midweek Mediawatch. Catch you then. In the meantime, follow Mediawatch and listen on any podcast app to make sure you never miss an episode.